Sometimes God hides the people we love in the last place we would ever think to look. Rainwater slid slowly down the tinted windows of the black Rolls-Royce as Richard Whitmore sat silently in the back seat, his expensive charcoal coat folded neatly across his lap. Downtown Chicago blurred past him in streaks of gray and gold, towering buildings fading into rusted fire escapes and cracked sidewalks the farther the car moved south. Marcus sat across from him, reviewing numbers on a tablet, speaking calmly about a merger worth nearly $400 million. But Richard barely heard a word. His tired blue eyes remained fixed on the city outside. 52 years old, billionaire, owner of Whitmore Global Holdings, one of the most powerful men in America. And still, every single night, he went home to an empty penthouse and a framed photograph of a little girl who never came back. The SUV slowed near a crowded intersection where flashing market lights reflected against puddles in the street. Traffic's backed up, sir, the driver muttered. Richard gave a quiet nod, distracted. Then he saw her. At first, it was only movement. A young woman standing beneath a faded blue tarp beside a small taco cart, steam rising around her as cold rain dripped from the edge of the canopy. She wore a worn brown hoodie beneath a denim jacket 2 sizes too big, blonde hair tied into a loose ponytail, sleeves rolled to her elbows despite the freezing wind. She couldn't have been older than 22. A teenage boy wearing designer sneakers shoved past an elderly homeless man near the cart, knocking over his paper cup of coins onto the wet pavement. "Watch where you're sleeping, old man." The boy laughed loudly. People looked away, everyone except her. The young woman stepped out from behind the cart immediately. "Hey," she snapped sharply. "Pick that up." The boy smirked. "Mind your business." "You made the mess," she shot back. "So clean it up." Richard straightened slowly in his seat. Something about her voice made his chest tighten. The boy rolled his eyes and started walking away, but the girl moved in front of him, blocking his path with fearless calm. "You got money for those shoes," she said coldly, pointing toward the scattered coins. "Then you got money to act like a decent human being." A few people nearby stopped to watch. Embarrassed, the boy cursed under his breath, bent down, and shoved the wet bills back into the old man's shaking hands before storming off into the rain. The girl exhaled softly and crouched beside the homeless man. "You okay, Mr. Jenkins?" she asked gently. The sudden warmth in her voice hit Richard even harder. She handed the man a fresh cup of coffee from the cart and smiled like kindness cost her nothing at all. Then she laughed quietly at something the old man whispered. And Richard froze. Completely froze. That laugh. His breathing stopped. His eyes locked on the silver necklace resting against her throat. A tiny angel pendant. His daughter's necklace. Richard's fingers trembled as memories slammed into him all at once. A little girl running barefoot through a white hallway. Tiny hands reaching for him. "Daddy, look what Mommy gave me." 15 years vanished in a heartbeat. "Sir?" Marcus asked cautiously. Richard didn't answer. Outside, the girl pushed damp strands of blonde hair behind her ear while handing tacos to construction workers standing under umbrellas. Her smile was tired but real. Her eyes bright despite the cold. And for the first time in 15 years, Richard Whitmore felt his heart beating like a terrified father instead of a billionaire. "Pull over," he whispered hoarsely. Marcus looked confused. "Sir." Richard never took his eyes off the girl. "Pull the car over now." The rain had softened into a cold drizzle by the time Richard stepped out of the car, the sharp scent of wet pavement mixing with grilled meat and cigarette smoke drifting through the crowded street market. Water splashed against his polished shoes almost instantly, but he did not care. His entire body felt numb. Marcus hurried beside him holding an umbrella overhead, though Richard barely noticed. His eyes remained locked on the young woman behind the taco cart. Up close, she looked even more familiar. The shape of her eyes, the small dimple near the corner of her mouth when she smiled, even the way she tucked her hair behind her ear while listening to customers reminded him painfully of someone he had once loved more than life itself. Emily. The name echoed inside his chest like an old prayer he had repeated for 15 years. The young woman handed a paper plate to a construction worker and laughed softly at his joke before turning toward a small portable radio resting near the grill. A quiet melody drifted through the rain. Richard stopped breathing again. It was the song, not the original version, but the melody was unmistakable. His late wife used to hum that exact lullaby every night while rocking little Emily to sleep in the nursery overlooking Lake Michigan. Richard felt his throat tighten painfully. "Sir," Marcus whispered carefully, "this could be coincidence." But Richard already knew it was not. The girl glanced toward him suddenly, blue eyes meeting his for the first time. Calm, curious, completely unaware that the man standing in front of her had spent half his life searching for her face in crowds. "You buying something?" she asked casually. Her voice carried a slight rasp from the cold air. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had prepared billion-dollar speeches in boardrooms without blinking. He had negotiated deals with presidents and investors across the world. But now standing 3 feet from a girl selling $5 tacos beneath a leaking tarp, he felt terrified. Marcus stepped in smoothly. "2 coffees," he said politely. "And whatever is freshest." The girl nodded. "You got it." Richard watched her hands as she worked quickly across the grill. Small scar near the wrist. Exactly where Emily had burned herself at age 7 trying to steal pancakes too early on Christmas morning. Richard remembered carrying her crying little body to the sink while his wife laughed so hard she nearly dropped the spatula. The memory hit so hard he had to grip the edge of the cart to steady himself. The girl noticed immediately. "You okay, sir?" she asked. "You look pale." "Sir." "Not Dad. Just another stranger in an expensive coat." Richard swallowed hard. "I am fine," he managed quietly. She studied him for another second before handing him the coffee. "You sure?" she asked gently. "It is freezing out here." That kindness nearly destroyed him. After everything life had apparently done to her, she still sounded warm. Human. Good. Richard stared down at the angel necklace resting against her hoodie. "That necklace," he said softly. "Where did you get it?" Her fingers instinctively touched the pendant. For the first time, her expression changed slightly. "Guarded now." "I have had it forever," she answered carefully. "Why?" Richard's chest tightened. "It looks familiar." She shrugged lightly. "A woman who raised me said I was wearing it when she found me." Richard felt the world tilt beneath him. Marcus slowly lowered his eyes, realizing the same horrifying truth at the exact same moment. The girl gave them a small, polite smile and returned to serving customers, unaware that the billionaire standing in front of her was no longer seeing Chicago around him anymore. He was seeing a little blonde girl in pink rain boots running through the halls of a mansion 15 years ago, laughing as she shouted, "Daddy, catch me." And for the first time since the day she disappeared, Richard Whitmore felt hope enter his heart so suddenly it almost hurt. Richard barely remembered getting back into the car. The door closed softly beside him, shutting out the noise of the street market, but the image of the young woman remained burned into his mind. Rain tapped steadily against the windows as the SUV pulled away from the curb, yet Richard kept turning to look behind them as if afraid she might disappear again the second he lost sight of her. Marcus sat silently across from him for almost a full minute before finally speaking. "You think it is really her?" Richard let out a slow breath that sounded almost broken. "I know my daughter's eyes." His voice was barely above a whisper. The city lights reflected across his face, revealing something Marcus had not seen in years. Hope. Dangerous hope. Richard reached into the inner pocket of his coat with trembling fingers and removed an old leather wallet worn soft with age. Inside, tucked carefully behind several credit cards, was a faded photograph of a little blonde girl sitting on his shoulders near a lakefront carousel. Emily Whitmore, age 7, smiling with melted ice cream all over her cheeks while clutching a silver angel necklace in her tiny hands. Richard stared at the photo in silence. "Same necklace," he murmured. "Same eyes. Same scar." Marcus nodded slowly. "It is possible." Richard looked up sharply. "Possible." His voice cracked for the first time in years. "Marcus, 15 years ago they told me my daughter was probably dead." The words hung heavily between them. Marcus lowered his eyes respectfully. He had been there the night everything collapsed. The police. The helicopters. The endless interviews. Richard screaming his daughter's name until his voice gave out at sunrise. The newspapers had called it America's most tragic missing child case for nearly a year before the world slowly moved on. But Richard never did. Every birthday, he bought a present and left it untouched in her old bedroom. Every Christmas, he lit the tree in the mansion even though no children remained there anymore. He had spent millions hiring private investigators across 3 countries chasing impossible rumors, because the idea of giving up hurt more than the humiliation of false hope. And now somehow, she had been selling tacos beneath a leaking tarp less than 9 miles from his corporate headquarters. Richard suddenly leaned forward. "Find out everything," he ordered quietly. "Where she lives, who raised her, how she got there. Everything." Marcus hesitated. Without approaching her, Richard closed his eyes briefly. That question hurt more than expected. Every part of him wanted to run back there immediately, fall to his knees, and hold his daughter for the first time in 15 years. But another part of him was terrified. What if she hated him? What if she believed he abandoned her? What if the truth destroyed the fragile life she had managed to build? "Not yet," Richard answered finally. "I need to know who took her from me first." The SUV entered downtown Chicago again, skyscrapers rising around them like walls of glass and steel. Richard suddenly noticed how cold everything looked compared to the warmth of that tiny taco cart. He glanced down at the coffee cup still sitting in his hand. She had written something on the side with black marker. A tiny smiley face beside 2 words. "Stay warm." Richard stared at the handwriting for several silent seconds before his throat tightened again. Emily used to draw those same crooked smiley faces on his business notes when she was little because she said adults looked too serious all the time. He looked away quickly, blinking hard. Marcus pretended not to notice. Outside, the city continued moving like normal. Horns, neon lights, crowded sidewalks, billion-dollar buildings. But inside the black SUV, Richard Whitmore sat completely, still realizing something that terrified him more than losing his fortune ever could. His daughter had grown up without him. And somehow, despite all the wealth and power in his hands, he could never get those lost 15 years back. The next morning, Richard canceled 3 meetings, ignored 12 calls from investors in New York, and sat alone inside his office staring at a photograph that had not left his desk drawer in over a decade. Sunlight spilled across the massive windows behind him, illuminating polished marble floors and walls lined with awards worth more money than most people would earn in a lifetime. Yet none of it mattered now. His attention stayed fixed on the old picture of little Emily wearing pink rain boots and missing her 2 front teeth. He remembered that day perfectly. She had insisted on jumping in puddles after a thunderstorm while her mother laughed nearby, holding grocery bags. Richard could still hear her tiny voice shouting, "Daddy, bigger puddle," before splashing muddy water all over his expensive suit. Back then, losing a suit had felt important. Now he would have traded every building he owned just to hear that laugh one more time. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Marcus entered carrying a thin folder. Richard stood immediately. "Tell me." Marcus placed the folder carefully on the desk. "Her name is Emily Carter," he began quietly. "At least that is the name she uses." Richard's heartbeat quickened instantly. Emily. Even fate had not managed to take her name away completely. Marcus continued. "She lives in a small apartment above a laundromat on West Fulton Street. No criminal record. No debt. No social media presence beyond a fundraiser page for homeless families in her neighborhood." Richard listened silently while Marcus opened the folder further. The woman who raised her was named Sarah Carter. She passed away from heart failure 3 years ago. Richard lowered his eyes briefly. A stranger had raised his daughter while he sat inside penthouses and boardrooms, believing she was gone forever. The guilt pressed against his chest like concrete. "What kind of woman was Sarah?" he asked softly. Marcus gave a small, thoughtful pause. "According to neighbors? Kind. Worked 2 jobs. Fostered abandoned children unofficially when she could not afford the legal process." Richard swallowed hard. "She saved her." Marcus nodded once. "Looks that way." Richard sat back slowly in his chair, emotions twisting painfully inside him. For 15 years he had imagined monsters taking Emily away. But somewhere in the middle of all that darkness, one exhausted woman with barely enough money for herself had apparently chosen to love a frightened little girl she found alone. Richard glanced toward the skyline outside his office windows. Thousands of people moving below like shadows. How many times had Emily walked cold streets while he attended charity galas pretending to care about families? The thought made him sick. Marcus hesitated before speaking again. "There is something else." Richard looked up. "She volunteers every Wednesday night at St. Mary's Shelter. Feeds families. Tutors children." Richard closed his eyes briefly. Even after growing up in poverty, Emily still spent what little she had helping others. just like her mother. His late wife used to stop the car every winter to hand out blankets to homeless people downtown, while Richard impatiently checked his watch. People matter more than schedules, she always told him. Back then he thought kindness was a luxury. Now he realized it had been the only thing that truly mattered. Richard opened his eyes again slowly. Does she know who I am? Marcus shook his head. I do not think so. But she clearly dislikes wealthy people. Richard gave a faint, humorless smile. She has every reason to. He stood and walked toward the giant windows overlooking Chicago. Somewhere beneath those towering buildings and endless traffic lights, his daughter was probably setting up her taco cart again, unaware that her father had spent 15 years grieving a child who was alive all along. Richard pressed one hand against the cold glass. Tonight, he said quietly, I am going back. Marcus looked surprised. As Richard Whitmore? Richard stared out at the city for a long, silent moment before answering softly. No, just a lonely man buying tacos from his daughter. The cold wind coming off Lake Michigan carried the smell of rain and fried onions through the narrow streets as Richard stepped carefully across cracked pavement toward the taco cart again the following evening. This time he came alone. No driver. No bodyguards. No custom suit worth more than most people's rent. He wore dark jeans, an old Navy jacket, and a plain gray baseball cap pulled low enough to hide the face half of Chicago recognized from magazines and financial news channels. For the first time in years, Richard Whitmore walked through the city without people opening doors for him or pretending to laugh at his jokes. And strangely, it felt easier to breathe that way. The market buzzed softly with life despite the cold. Street vendors shouted prices while children chased each other between folding tables covered in cheap jewelry and secondhand shoes. Somewhere nearby, an old speaker played classic soul music distorted by static. Richard spotted Emily immediately beneath the glowing string lights hanging over her cart. She stood on a milk crate trying to adjust the tarp overhead while muttering frustratedly to herself. One side had collapsed again from the rainwater collecting on top. Without thinking, Richard stepped forward and steadied the metal pole before it could fall. Emily looked down quickly, startled. Oh, thanks. Richard gave a small nod. Looks heavier than it seems. Story of my life, she replied dryly, climbing down carefully. Richard almost smiled. Even her sarcasm sounded familiar. Emily brushed rainwater off her sleeves before noticing him properly. You came back. There was curiosity in her voice now, not suspicion. Richard suddenly realized how dangerous that felt. I said the coffee was good, he answered quietly. I had to test if the tacos were too. She laughed softly under her breath while turning back toward the grill. That might be the saddest excuse for tacos I have ever heard. Richard sat carefully on the small plastic stool beside the cart while Emily worked. Steam rose into the cold air between them. For a few moments, neither spoke. Richard simply watched her moving quickly between customers, offering extra food to people who clearly could not pay full price without embarrassing them about it. A little boy approached the cart clutching 2 crumpled dollar bills. Emily glanced at the money and shook her head gently. Keep it for your mom's medicine. The boy hesitated. But you already fed us yesterday. Emily smiled and handed him 2 wrapped tacos anyway. Then I guess we are both making bad financial decisions. The boy grinned and ran off into the crowd. Richard stared at her quietly. You lose money doing that. Emily shrugged while flipping tortillas across the grill. People are hungry. The answer came so simply it hurt him. Richard spent years attending million-dollar charity dinners listening to executives debate percentages and tax benefits, while his daughter understood compassion better standing beside a $500 taco cart. Emily handed him a paper plate. Careful. The sauce is spicy. Their fingers brushed briefly as he took it. Such a small moment. Yet Richard felt emotion rise sharply in his chest anyway, because 15 years ago little Emily used to warn him exactly the same way whenever she helped cook pancakes on Sunday mornings. Careful, Daddy. Hot syrup. He looked down quickly before she could notice the pain crossing his face. Emily leaned casually against the cart beside him. So what do you actually do? She asked. Richard hesitated. Business. That sounds suspiciously vague. Maybe I am a suspiciously vague person. Emily laughed again. Warm. Easy. Real. Richard realized with painful clarity that this was the first genuine conversation he had enjoyed in years. No investors. No reporters. No people wanting something from him. Just his daughter talking to him beneath cheap string lights in the middle of a rainy Chicago market, while completely unaware who he really was. And for one selfish moment, Richard almost wanted to keep it that way forever. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard found himself returning to the market almost every evening. Sometimes he arrived carrying coffee for Emily before she even opened the cart. Other nights, he simply sat nearby pretending to read a newspaper while secretly watching her move through the crowded street with a kind of quiet strength he could not stop admiring. The market had started recognizing him as the quiet older businessman who tipped too much and listened more than he talked. Emily teased him about it constantly. "You know you are terrible at blending in, right?" she said one night while wiping down the counter after closing. Richard looked up from the folding chair beside the cart. "What gave me away?" Emily smirked lightly. "Your shoes cost more than my rent." Richard glanced down at the polished leather boots he forgot to change before leaving the office earlier that afternoon. For the first time in years, he laughed. A real laugh. Soft and surprised even to himself. Emily paused briefly at the sound, studying him with curiosity. "You should do that more often." "Do what?" "Laugh." She shrugged casually. "Makes you look less sad." The words hit him harder than she realized. Richard lowered his eyes toward the steaming cup in his hands. He wondered if children could somehow still sense the wounds of their parents, no matter how many years separated them. Emily sat beside him on the edge of the cart, pulling her jacket tighter against the cold. "You know," she said quietly, "you remind me of someone sometimes." Richard's heartbeat stumbled instantly. "Who?" Emily looked out toward the busy street before answering. "Someone I barely remember." Richard stayed perfectly still. "My mom used to say I had a father somewhere." Her voice softened with distant uncertainty. "But honestly, I do not remember much about him anymore." Richard felt every muscle in his body tighten painfully. "Do you remember anything?" Emily hesitated. "Pieces." She gave a faint, embarrassed smile. "It sounds stupid when I say it out loud." "Try me." Emily looked down at the angel necklace resting against her hoodie. "I remember music." Richard stopped breathing. "And this huge white room with windows taller than doors." Her brows furrowed, as if struggling to pull memories through fog. "Sometimes I remember somebody carrying me on his shoulders while I laughed." Richard gripped the coffee cup harder to steady his shaking hands. Emily continued softly, unaware she was tearing his heart open one sentence at a time. "But mostly I remember feeling abandoned after Sarah died." Richard turned away quickly, pretending to watch traffic while emotion burned behind his eyes. Emily sighed quietly beside him. "I know it sounds dramatic, but losing the only person who cared about you changes how you see people." Richard swallowed hard. "Sarah cared about you very much." Emily looked surprised. "How do you know that?" Richard froze for half a second before answering carefully. "People who raise children without expecting anything back are rare." Emily smiled faintly at that. Yeah, she was rare. A cold gust of wind swept through the market, rattling the tarp overhead. Without thinking, Richard removed his scarf and handed it toward her. Emily blinked. "I am fine." "You are freezing." She hesitated before finally accepting it with a small, grateful smile. Richard watched her wrap the scarf around herself, and suddenly another memory crashed into him so vividly it hurt. Little Emily at age 6 sitting on his lap during a snowstorm while wrapped in one of his oversized winter scarves because she insisted it smelled like home. Richard looked away toward the city lights before his daughter could notice tears gathering in his eyes. Then Emily said something that nearly broke him completely. "You know what is weird?" she asked softly. "Being around you kind of feels familiar." That night, Richard sat alone in the back corner of his penthouse, staring out over the glowing Chicago skyline while the city stretched endlessly beneath him like another world entirely. The apartment around him remained silent except for the ticking of an antique clock Emily's mother once loved. Marble floors, designer furniture, floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking millions of dollars in real estate. Everything polished, everything expensive, everything empty. Richard loosened his tie slowly and closed his eyes, hearing Emily's voice repeating in his mind. "Being around you kind of feels familiar." The words stayed with him long after he left the market. He should have felt relieved, hopeful even. But instead he felt terrified because the closer he became to her, the more impossible the truth felt. How do you tell your daughter you searched 15 years too late? How do you explain to a child that money could not save her? A soft knock interrupted the silence. Marcus stepped into the penthouse, carrying another folder, though his expression looked far more troubled this time. Richard immediately noticed. "What is it?" Marcus hesitated briefly before setting the folder onto the table. "I dug deeper into the original case files." Richard slowly stood. His chest tightened instantly. "And?" Marcus exhaled carefully. "There were inconsistencies." Richard's eyes sharpened. "What kind of inconsistencies?" Marcus opened the file. The nanny who disappeared the same week Emily vanished received large deposits into offshore accounts shortly afterward. Richard felt cold all over. Who authorized the transfers? Marcus looked up slowly. Victoria Hale. Silence filled the room instantly. Richard stared at him in disbelief. Victoria, his former fiancée after Emily's mother died. Elegant, sophisticated, perfect in front of cameras. She had stood beside him during every press conference while he begged the public for help finding his daughter. She cried beside him at memorial services, held his hand at the funeral for an empty coffin. Richard suddenly gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles whitened. "No," he whispered hoarsely. "There is more." Marcus continued carefully. Victoria gained temporary control of the Whitmore family trust 6 months after Emily disappeared. Richard turned away. Sharply, nausea rising in his throat. For years he blamed himself. His work schedule, his absence, his failures as a father. But now another possibility crawled into his mind slowly and horribly. What if Emily was not lost? What if someone deliberately took her away? Richard walked toward the windows, breathing unevenly. Rain began tapping softly against the glass again. Chicago blurred beneath him in silver streaks. "Does Victoria know Emily is alive?" he asked quietly. Marcus shook his head. "No evidence yet." Richard closed his eyes briefly. Thank God. At least for now, Emily remained safe. Or as safe as someone living alone in a rough neighborhood could be. Suddenly Richard remembered the flickering streetlights above her taco cart. The broken apartment Marcus described. The way Emily kept offering free food to strangers while barely making enough for herself. His daughter had spent years surviving while the people responsible attended galas in designer gowns. The injustice of it burned inside him. Marcus spoke again carefully. "What do you want to do?" Richard opened his eyes slowly. "Protect her." The answer came instantly. "Not billionaire. Not CEO. Father." Marcus nodded once. "And when will you tell her the truth?" Richard looked down at the scarf Emily accidentally left inside his car the night before. It still carried a faint scent of rain and grilled onions from the market. He picked it up gently in both hands. "I do not know," he admitted quietly. "Every time she smiles at me, I keep thinking if I tell her too soon, I might lose her all over again." Across the city, unaware of the storm quietly building around her life, Emily locked up her taco cart beneath the dim market lights and started the long walk home alone through the cold Chicago night. While inside a glass tower miles away, her father realized someone had stolen 15 years from both of them. 3 nights later, freezing rain hammered the streets hard enough to drive most vendors home early. But Emily stayed beneath the flickering tarp beside her taco cart, serving hot coffee to anyone still wandering through the market. Richard watched from across the street for a moment before crossing, carefully through puddles gathering along the curb. Even soaked in rain and exhausted from hours of work, Emily still smiled at every person who approached her. It amazed him how much light one human being could carry after surviving so much darkness. "You know, normal people stay home during weather like this," Emily called out as Richard approached the cart. Richard removed droplets of rain from his coat sleeve. "Maybe I am not normal. That much is obvious." She handed him a steaming cup without asking for money anymore. Somewhere over the past weeks, he had stopped feeling like a customer and started feeling dangerously close to family. Richard wrapped his hands around the warm cup while studying her face beneath the dim lights. Every day, he noticed something new. The tiny freckle near her chin that matched her mother's exactly. The way she tilted her head while listening. The habit of humming softly whenever she focused on cooking. Emily suddenly looked toward the dark street beyond the market entrance, her smile fading slightly. Richard noticed immediately. Something wrong. She hesitated. Probably nothing. But her eyes kept drifting toward a black luxury sedan parked half a block away with tinted windows facing the market. Richard felt unease settle quietly into his stomach. "Do you know them?" Emily shook her head slowly. "That car has been showing up all week." Richard's grip tightened around the coffee cup. Why did you not tell me? Emily gave a small shrug. I figured rich people just get lost sometimes. The irony of the statement almost hurt. Richard forced calm into his voice. And if they are not lost? Emily tried to smile, but he could see tension in her face now. Then maybe somebody important finally realized this neighborhood exists. Richard glanced toward the sedan again. A familiar feeling crawled up his spine. Instinct. Danger. Before he could speak further, Marcus suddenly appeared beside him beneath the rain, holding an umbrella. Richard instantly understood from Marcus's expression that something was wrong. Sir, Marcus said quietly, I need a word. Emily blinked in surprise. You brought security now? Richard looked uncomfortable immediately. He is an old friend. Emily raised an eyebrow. You have very intense-looking friends. Marcus barely acknowledged her before leaning toward Richard. Victoria knows, he whispered. Richard went completely still. Rain pounded harder against the tarp overhead. How? Marcus lowered his voice further. Someone inside the firm leaked information from the reopened case files. Richard's pulse spiked instantly. Where is she now? At the Whitmore Foundation gala downtown. Marcus glanced carefully toward the black sedan. And I do not think that car is here by accident. Richard slowly turned toward Emily. She stood only a few feet away serving coffee to an elderly man, completely unaware that the danger surrounding her had just become very real. Richard suddenly saw her not as the strong young woman running a taco cart, but as the 7-year-old child he once failed to protect. Not again. Never again. Emily looked over curiously. Everything okay? Richard forced himself to nod. Yeah. But his voice sounded distant even to himself. Emily studied him carefully through the rain. You look scared. Richard looked directly into his daughter's eyes, feeling the weight of 15 stolen years crushing against his chest. I am, he admitted softly. Emily frowned slightly. Of what? Richard opened his mouth to answer just as thunder rolled above the city and the black sedan slowly started moving closer toward the market. The black sedan rolled slowly to the curb beside the market, headlights cutting through the heavy rain, while every instinct inside Richard screamed that something terrible was about to happen. Emily followed his gaze, confusion flickering across her face as two sharply dressed men stepped out beneath umbrellas. Neither looked like they belonged anywhere near West Fulton Street. One of them scanned the market carefully before locking eyes with Emily. Richard moved instantly, stepping closer to her without even realizing he had done it. Emily noticed. Hey, she said quietly, what is going on? Before Richard could answer, Marcus approached the men directly, blocking their path with calm authority. Rain poured harder around them, drowning out most of the conversation, but Richard caught enough. Miss Hale would like to speak with the girl. Richard's blood ran cold. Emily frowned. Who? Richard turned toward her fully now, panic finally breaking through the careful walls he had built around himself for weeks. Emily, he said urgently, you need to go home tonight. Her expression shifted immediately. What? Please. Emily stared at him in disbelief. You are scaring me. Richard opened his mouth, searching desperately for words that could protect her without destroying everything at once. But before he could speak, one of the men stepped around Marcus and approached the cart with a polite smile that somehow felt colder than the rain itself. Emily Carter, the man asked smoothly. Emily crossed her arms cautiously. Who is asking? A representative from Whitmore Foundation. Richard's stomach dropped. The man continued. Miss Victoria Hale has taken an interest in your community work. She would like to invite you to tomorrow evening's gala downtown. Emily blinked in shock. Me? Richard stepped forward immediately. She is not interested. The man looked at him carefully now. Recognition flashed briefly across his face before disappearing again. Mr. Whitmore. Emily froze completely beside the cart. The world seemed to stop moving for one unbearable second. Rain hammered the tarp overhead while Emily slowly turned toward Richard, confusion spreading across her face. Whitmore, she whispered. Richard felt his heart collapse. The man realized his mistake instantly and stepped back awkwardly, but it was too late. Emily stared at Richard with growing disbelief. You are Richard Whitmore? Richard could not speak. Her eyes widened further as pieces suddenly started connecting inside her mind. The expensive shoes, the vague answers, the security, the sadness in his eyes whenever she mentioned family. Emily stepped backward slowly. You lied to me. Emily, please. No. Hurt flashed across her face sharper than anger. You are one of them. Richard shook his head desperately. I came because of you. Why? She demanded, voice trembling now. Richard looked at her standing beneath the leaking tarp, wearing his scarf around her shoulders, rain dripping beside the angel necklace he recognized 15 years ago. He realized there was no safe way left to say it anymore. No perfect moment. No perfect explanation. Just truth. Raw and terrifying. Richard stepped closer slowly, eyes filled with emotion. Because 15 years ago, he whispered brokenly, someone took my little girl away from me. Emily's breathing stopped. Richard reached carefully into his coat pocket and pulled out the faded photograph he carried every single day for half his life. His hand trembled as he held it toward her. A little blonde girl sat laughing on a man's shoulders beside Lake Michigan, wearing pink rain boots and a silver angel necklace. Emily stared at the picture silently while rainwater dripped from her hair onto the pavement below. Richard's voice cracked completely. I never stopped looking for you. Emily's eyes slowly lifted toward his face, and suddenly memories shattered through her mind all at once. White hallways, a music box melody, strong arms lifting her high into the air while somebody laughed beside her mother. Daddy. The word hit her like lightning. Richard saw the exact moment recognition reached her eyes. Tears filled his instantly. Emily, he whispered softly, you are my daughter.